We're coming toward the close of our study, actually. One more lesson after this, having to do with the construction of the tabernacle and then Israel's leaving Mount Sinai. But today we want to talk about chapters 31 to 34 in the book of Exodus, which provide a kind of a interim set of circumstances that we'll take a look at between the time that God gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. And when we say the law, we mean really more than the 10 Commandments. He was there 40 days and 40 nights and gave the instructions that are included in several chapters after chapter 20 when the 10 Commandments are given there. So when he came down from the mountain, that's what we're going to pick up on this morning. You'll remember they've come from Egypt with the miraculous power of God exhibited in several situations coming down. Probably, I guess, the most impressive to all of those people was the separation of the Red Sea and their ability to go through. That keeps coming up in the Old Testament text as the deliverance miracle, the crossing of the Red Sea. I don't know what you would have been most impressed with if you saw the miracles that God did. It would have been amazing to me when God brought water out of the rock. We've driven over Mount Eagle going toward Nashville and seen water coming down the side of the mountain. Looks like it's coming out of the rocks there. We've seen that. But we haven't seen enough water coming out to feed 1 million people and sustain their lives, have we? And that must have been an amazing miracle. A number of miracles were done coming to Mount Sinai and being able to live there. God gave them manna and quail and fed them and provided for them miraculously in some of these ways in those days. So it was important for them to know that God was leading them and directing them in every way. I do want to thank Rick for his work in the last couple of weeks. He led us through the section on God's orders for the tabernacle and for the priesthood, and very thorough examination of that in the book of Exodus provided. It is interesting that the section we're talking about today, chapters 31 through 34, happened between the time that God gave the instructions and provided the pattern for the tabernacle and the actual construction of the tabernacle. And there's a period of time in between there that you want to watch. On first reading, as you go through Exodus, you think that the tabernacle was constructed back here earlier. But then you get to the end of the book and here it all is again. And a lot of the instruction concerning the furniture of the tabernacle is given twice in the text. And I think there's something to that, because later, of course, the writer of Hebrews is going to say, do all things according to the pattern as was before. And so he's wanting to show us how insistent God is in these religious practices and religious accoutrements that are provided there, that this is all God's design and that God does it. That'll be the first thing we'll look at here in just a minute. So you want to watch these lessons on authority should not be overlooked. People come in here sometimes and wonder, now, you all don't have instruments of music, and you don't do this, and you don't have a band, and you don't do things the way everybody else does, and you're insistent on doing it just like what's in the Bible and not anything else. That's on purpose, because we read how that when people don't be consistent with what God says in His Word, trouble comes. And it comes from the Lord, and there's great disaster happens in some of these stories where it doesn't fit God's pattern. So you want to take the lessons, listen to the lessons in the text, and don't forget the point of them as we go. So, the prescriptive plans for the tabernacle and the priesthood were given to Moses on the Mount. And that concludes with chapter 31, the first paragraph of chapter 31. The actual construction of the tabernacle. See, they've got to gather the materials, they've got to get everything prepared to put it together. That's recorded in chapter 35 to the end of the book. So we'll look at that next week. Okay? So this is the tabernacle, and it's by God's design. And some of the decoration is probably imagined, but a lot of those colors are seen, and the materials are used that would look something like some of that. Okay. Chapter 31. Let's keep your Bibles open now and just kind of watch as we go. In the first paragraph, verses 1 through 11, God chose two men, particularly by name. One is Bezalel, is his name, or Bezalel, and he's from the tribe of Judah. And the other man is Aholiab, and he's of the tribe of Dan. And he chose these two men to be in charge of the construction of the tabernacle and the furniture and all of that. We would call them construction engineers or contractors, is what we would call them. So God has somebody in charge. It's not going to be Moses and Aaron to do that. You might think that God would do that, but they're busy. Moses and Aaron have lots to do, both of them, and are very responsible in their positions. So you get a construction engineer or a contractor to be in charge. Apparently, Bezalel is primary in that, if you read your text, right? And then he comes along and has an assistant who is Aholiab. And then there are others. The text does not mention all of them by name, but there are others that are going to be doing work on this tabernacle. What we want to notice is that Bezalel now is going to be very inspired by God in what he does. Aholiab will be inspired too, and some of those others. If you see in your text down where, about verse 6 or 7 in the text, it's going to suggest that all of these that are especially chosen to do this work are going to be inspired of God. Now, what does that say to you? Okay. And the knowledge to do it. God is going to control this situation, isn't he? He's going to tell them how to do everything they do. Now, he's given instructions on that, but you can imagine when you're trying to design these poles and these hooks and all these little things that go into this, God's going to show them how he wants it done, you see. Yes?
Great lesson for us, just because we know what we want. We still may have to educate somebody into how to do it.
Exactly. And we may have to go and look ourselves at what God says to get it right. And that's what we try to do, you see. But what this is going to say is God's hand is in it. And he inspires these leaders, particularly in the construction of the tabernacle. The text says, I have filled him with the Spirit of God. That's Bezalel. I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. You see. So let's watch that message come through in the last part of the book of Exodus. Bezalel is the lead. Aholiab is apparently his right-hand man getting this work done on the construction. Okay, we got that one? All right, and here you can see if this is a correct rendition of what these pieces of furniture were like. You can see how there would need to be some care taken and maybe some instruction from God on how to design all of this and get it just right. You see. Okay. Now let's move on to another subject for a moment. In verse 12 beginning, God is going to say to them, observe the Sabbath. We're going to keep the Sabbath day. So he has people constructing the tabernacle, and now he's saying to the congregation, we're going to keep the Sabbath. And that's going to be a sign to them. Surely my Sabbaths, verse 13, you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. Between me and who? The children of Israel. Now, here's our message. We want to understand the Sabbath keeping was ordered in the Ten Commandments, and it was given to the children of Israel. Do we observe the Sabbath today? No. Is it an observance for Christians? No. It was a sign between the children of Israel and God, and it would be for them throughout their generations. That does not include today. That's their generations under the law given at Mount Sinai in the Ten Commandments, which have been nailed to the cross, Jesus says. The apostles say for Jesus in the gospel age. So he says, this is my sign between you and me, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. What does that mean? He has set them apart. Now, they're not set apart by the Sabbath if everybody has the Sabbath. Do you see that? It's a special thing for the children of Israel, for the Jewish nation, while it was the nation of God's people under the law, you see. So he says, therefore, the children of Israel, verse 16, are you watching your text? Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. You see, so he brings the covenant. What is the covenant? What did the covenant say about the relationship between God and Israel? I'll be your God, and you will be my people. And he asked the people to do what? Basically to swear to it, didn't he? He asked them to commit to making him their God and not having other gods, and he would be their God and take care of them and fulfill all his promises to them. You see, that was the covenant, wasn't it? Was the covenant with all the nations. Did the covenant apply to the Moabites and the Edomites and all these others? No, it didn't. The covenant was especially for the children of Israel. And that's what God had said. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel. You see that? Forever. That word forever in the Old Testament suggests the idea of throughout the age that we're talking about, the period when the covenant was in effect. The covenant was taken away when Jesus Christ died on the cross, you see. Okay? So, where it says a sign between me and the children of Israel, Ezekiel chapter 20 says that as well. If you want another passage, Ezekiel calls back to God's establishment of this covenant. Okay? So the Sabbath is a sign. All these instructions are given to Moses on Mount Sinai in those 40 days, including the fourth commandment, which was, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Yes, sir. Sure.
And then you look at that,
Sure. That's right. That's right. Okay. Now, notice this is originally given, these two tablets of the testimony, they are called the tablets of the testimony. The word testimony suggests a pact between them and the covenant that was involved. And this tablet, the laws, the covenant laws, the Ten Commandments laws, are engraved with the finger of God, the text says. So God gave it to him, having done it himself, provided, written by God on both sides and engraved there. Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep. This is a good illustration, I think, when we say this is the sign of the covenant between them. We talk about the covenant of marriage when we're together. And the covenant in marriage is between one party and the other party. Correct? So, I sometimes say to my classes at school, and some of you have heard me do this before, but see this ring? That's between me and Linda. And what does it say? We're separated from everybody else to each other. Doesn't it say that? So if I gave a ring to every pretty girl I ever saw, what would Linda's ring she's got on back there now mean? It sure wouldn't mean much, would it? I'm sure she would. She'd probably throw it at me, is what she would probably do. So it's a covenant agreement. And the sign of that covenant is the Sabbath day. How was that a sign? It was a sign that God was their God and they were God's people. And they would worship God on the Sabbath, but they would not work. What did the nations see when they looked at Israel on Saturday? That's right. There was a difference. And what they would see was everybody stopping, no work, no travel, little movement. They could go to the synagogue if it were within a certain amount of space, less around a half a mile. They could go to the synagogue and worship God on the Sabbath. What the nation would see when they looked into Israel on Saturday was everything shut down, only worship, and they worshiped their one God, Yahweh, Jehovah. You see, that was a sign to everybody, to the nations, that these were God's people and God was their God. That was the sign. Right? There are two special signs. I've said this many times too. Two special signs in Israel of their relationship with God. One was the Sabbath. That was the national thing. What was the other one? Circumcision. That was the personal sign between the men of Israel and God. They were God's people, circumcised, where the nations were not, you see. So that was the personal sign. And the collective national sign was the Sabbath. Everything shut down. Okay? So please remember some of that. Now then, when Moses delayed coming down, the people went to Aaron, and they called on him to make gods to lead them, since Moses, who was their recognized leader, was no longer with them. They believed that Moses was gone, and he had been their leader, and he had insisted that God was leading them through him. Now he was out of the picture. So what was going to happen? They thought they should have they should have a golden calf to worship them. So they brought gold, and Aaron melted it down, and he formed a golden calf. And God said they had corrupted themselves. They were stiff-necked. There's that term is used several times in this text as you read down through it. He was angry. He threatened to destroy them and to make a nation from Moses. And Moses pleaded, and Jehovah relented. The text tells us in that. So, I don't know what that calf looked like. It's called a golden calf in our English translations. The Egyptians worship cows, sometimes female cows, sometimes the bulls. The bulls emphasize strength to them. And when they worshiped the bull, that was the strong animal that was among them to protect or to fight for them or to do whatever else. So I don't know what this calf looked like, how old it was, whether calf in our thinking is a little animal. I don't know how much gold they brought and how big this thing was. See, there are some things about this you'd kind of like to have a good HD photograph of to know what it looked like. But at any rate, they sinned with this calf. When Moses came down and he saw the calf, he was very angry. God was angry first. And now Moses, when he sees it, he's angry, you see. God sees it and tells Moses to get down. Go down there. Get down there. And he does. So he first went to Aaron. And Aaron said, the people brought gold. I put it in the fire, and this calf came out. Like he had nothing. This is like a little kid would do, you know. It broke. Mama's prize antique lamp. I don't know, it just broke. Yeah, it just broke. The calf just came out. It just came out. How lame is that? Do you think? So the calf just came out, and Aaron should have restrained the people from demanding this. Aaron doesn't take responsibility. He had failed to stand up for God when the people came. He had failed to stand up for Moses, hadn't he, in all of this? So it's an interesting situation. So Moses goes to Aaron first and gets very little answer. And then he went to the people and he said, who's on the Lord's side? Come to me. And who came? The sons of Levi gather up and come. And he says, take your swords and go and kill your brothers in the nation, national brothers. And 3,000 people died that day. Lesson? Well, they had broken now the first commandments, the first 2 or 3 commandments, hadn't they? With their idolatry with this calf. So we could talk about what was in everybody's mind. Some writers talk about Aaron doing this just to appease the people. You don't appease the people when the worship of God is at stake, you see. So all kinds of things we could talk about. Okay. So, because of this, Moses comes. Now we're in chapter 33. Moses comes, and God is going to meet with him. And Moses is told to speak to the people, saying, go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. There's that word again that we had before. In other words, God's saying, if I go in your midst, I'll destroy you because you're so stiff-necked you don't do right. And if I'm in the midst of you, I'll destroy you. So when the people heard this, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. That's kind of interesting. How did Israel show their mourning? Historically, throughout their history. How'd they do that? What are you saying? Sackcloth, they would put on sackcloth. They would tear their clothing. They would put ashes on their heads. And so the people are mourning because why? What is it about this? Well, they had disappointed the Lord. What is? That's right. Right. And he says, I'm not going to go with you. You see. So Moses took his tent outside the camp, and he called it the tabernacle of meeting. Now, later, we will use that kind of terminology for the tabernacle, because God would come down upon the tabernacle occasionally. But here he's talking about a tent of meeting that's Moses' tent. Has the tabernacle been constructed yet? No, it hasn't really been constructed yet. You see that? So this is Moses' tent. And when he entered, though, the cloud came down at the door. And Jehovah spoke with Moses. Verse 9. Do you see that? Everybody? Okay. That cloud is representative of God's presence with these people and of his presence in the situation. So here we have that again. So Moses took his tent out of the camp, called it the tabernacle of meeting. When he entered, the cloud came down at the door, and Jehovah spoke with Moses. Okay? So they're going to have a little discussion. Have they talked before? Yeah, he's been up on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So who is God communicating with to the people? His inspired, chosen person. Who is Jesus going to communicate with us through? The apostles and prophets of the New Testament period, isn't he? He's going to do that and communicate with us through the written message delivered by the apostles and prophets of the New Testament. Okay? Got a question?
It says that the word used to spoken of as as a man speaks to his friend.
Uh-huh.
And it seems that it's not only just personal, but it's almost as an intimate tone.
It does. It does. It might be compared a little bit to Peter and James and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. That situation might be something similar to this. Moses' face is going to shine when he gets to the people, and Jesus shone his face on the Mount of Transfiguration. Okay. Moses said to Jehovah, "You told me to bring this people, but you did not let me know whom you will send with me." So Moses pled with God to go with them, and Jehovah said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." So Moses begged God to show him glory, his glory. And Jehovah said, "You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live." But Jehovah had him stand on a rock, and when my glory passes by, God says, God would cover him in the cleft of the rock with his hand. And while he passed by, God would remove his hand and allow him to see what God calls my back. Isn't that interesting? Those verses, chapters 33, 20, and 23 there. Special occasion to see anything of God firsthand, isn't it? As we go. So Jehovah told Moses, "Take 2 tablets and see me in the morning." Kind of like a doctor does, you know. So Moses cut the tablets and went up to Mount Sinai. And the text says, verse 6 and 7 of chapter 34, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. So what he's saying is God is relenting again, and he's going to go with the people and be among them. But the guilty will have to suffer their penalties. Those would be the idolaters, and I suppose some judgment upon those 3,000 that had been killed by the Levites earlier, you see. Okay? Any questions you want to ask here? Any comments? Who does that guy look like? Moses. All right. So there's going to be a renewal of the covenant now. in chapter 34. Begins at verse 10. And it includes all of these things that God is saying to them. These are special things you need to do. They're essential to the covenant. Destroy all the altars and the images of foreign gods. See, these things here are the first of those 10 commandments, how to do it. What is the order of this? How do you accomplish? Here's the covenant now. The covenant's going to be this. What do you do about that? Well, you destroy all the altars and the images of the foreign gods. When they get in the land and they live under God's rule, they have to get rid of all the other things, all the other gods. Do not intermarry with their sons and daughters. Why does he say? You all have your text open there. Don't intermarry with the Moabites, with the Edomites, with the Ammonites, with the Jebusites, with these nations around or these tribal peoples around. Don't intermarry. Why? Doesn't your text say something about that? Why not? Yeah. Lest you make a covenant with them, and these wives that they would take, or husbands in the other case, these marriage partners would lead them back into idolatry. See, that's always God's answer to why not intermarry with these people. And then he says, keep the feast, the unleavened bread. Do you see that? And then a little later there, the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost. See, Pentecost was, how long was it between Pentecost and Passover? 50 days. That's a week of weeks. How many is in a week? 7. 7 days. 7 times 7 is how many? 49. And on the next day, which was the Sabbath, was 50 days. So the Feast of Weeks, it was called. And I guess Matt will go into that in Leviticus a little more next time. Okay, and then the Feast of Ingathering at the harvest, the Feast of Harvest it was called, or the Feast of Ingathering. Those were the 3 times the people that were in Israel itself, on the land that God gave them, were required to go later to Jerusalem. And they would worship each year. 3 times they were required to go there for the worship. Okay? So keep those feasts. Why would that be important? For their remembrance of who they were and who they worshiped. You see, you can get out there by yourself somewhere and not gather with God's people and lose it. Don't do that. It can happen today. It can happen and has happened, I'm afraid, because of COVID with some people in our day. That's not a good thing. Get out on your own and not come worship with God's people. It's important to do that. So observe all the sacrifices. He's going to say, keep the Sabbath. See, all of these have to do with those first of the 10 commandments that relate to the relationship with God. And so they were to do these things. You got it? So when Moses came back down from the mountain after 40 days and nights, his face shone, and all the people were afraid. And Moses put a veil over his face. When he went into the tent, he took off the veil. It's just him and God at that point. You see. Paul refers to this over in 2 Corinthians. You might want to just make your little note, and we don't have time to talk about it now. I had thought maybe we'd look at this passage a little more. But Paul says the Jews were still veiled, not seeing what God had in store for his people. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away in Christ. The veil is taken away. So we can behold the glory of the Lord, Paul says. This is in 2 Corinthians 3. You can go and look at it and kind of tie that together. Okay? Well, we have one more lesson and big lessons to learn from Exodus, I think. Okay?